But the good news is if you cannot attend the event in person, it will still stream live to our Facebook and YouTube channels. Today is Veterans Day, a time for us to honor military veterans. And it is set here on November 11th because that was Armistice Day, or the day that ended World War I. As the state's World War Memorial, the Archives wanted to host this program today to honor the women who served in that war as nurses. I am very pleased to welcome the Registrar of the Alabama Department of Archives and History, Haley Aaron, to tell us more about those women. Haley, welcome.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Alex, and thank you everyone who is joining us for this virtual program. It's really an honor to share the stories of a few of Alabama's World War I nurses. When Annie Early Wheeler, who served in World War I and in the Spanish-American War as a nurse, was asked what attributes made a wartime nurse successful, she provided really a laundry list of attributes. She wrote, quote, "In order to accomplish anything worthwhile in war work, one needs all the strength, courage, fortitude, inspiration, endurance, and every other attribute that can be imagined. And above all, one must learn to so control their emotions that they can go with a smile into a ward where the wounds and sufferings are unimaginable and unspeakable." Let's think a little bit about that list: strength, courage, fortitude, inspiration, and endurance. I think those are qualities and attributes that we all aspire to have, and very rarely do we see a group of people express them so fully as Alabama's World War I nurses do. These women served their country at a time of tremendous uncertainty and change. 2 generations of nurses worked and watched as nursing, considered an occupation for volunteers during the Civil War, became one of the few professions open to women after World War I. During World War I, at hospitals in France and Italy, they saw the brutal effects of trench warfare, mustard gas, disease, and shell shock. And at home in Alabama, they tried to stem the tide of the quickly spreading influenza epidemic. Every day, they faced the unimaginable and the unspeakable, and they did what they could every day to heal and impart hope to those that were suffering. Today, I would like to start by looking at the way the nursing profession grew and changed before World War I, and then talk about just a few of the many remarkable Alabama nurses that served with courage and compassion at home and abroad. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, nursing was still a relatively new profession and one of the only careers open to women. In the United States, interest in nursing grew after the Civil War. So 2 of our most famous nurses, Florence Nightingale and Clara Barton, come onto the scene in the 1850s and the 1860s. In the 1850s, Florence Nightingale organized a corps of female volunteers to serve as nurses during the Crimean War. And then in the United States, Clara Barton volunteered for service with the U.S. Sanitary Commission and successfully petitioned Union officials to serve as a nurse in battlefield hospitals during the Civil War. Women on both sides of the Civil War followed her lead and served as volunteers in combat hospitals. As Nightingale and Barton became household names in the United States, interest in establishing more formal training programs for nurses grew. America's first nursing schools opened in the 1870s, mostly along the East Coast. And the first nursing schools in the South followed right around 20 years later and were typically located in urban centers such as Birmingham and New Orleans. In 1916, the state of Alabama issued nursing licenses for the first time, and by 1919, training hospitals were open in cities across the state, including Birmingham, Montgomery, Mobile, Talladega, and Decatur. I'd like to take a little bit of time to look at two of the state's earliest training programs, one at Tuskegee Institute and the second at St. Vincent's Hospital in Birmingham. Tuskegee Institute's Training School of Nurses was founded in 1892. Initially, student nurses completed their training hours at the school's infirmary, treating faculty and students who were sick on campus. But under the leadership of John A. Kinney, the program quickly expanded. The John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital, constructed by Tuskegee Institute students at a cost of $55,000, opened in 1913 to serve the Black community. As the hospital expanded, the nurses' training program also grew. In an article published in the American Journal of Nurses in 1910, Booker T. Washington wrote that the nursing program was so popular that the school could only admit about half of the applicants who applied to the program. Thanks to the growing number of hospitals throughout the South, the demand for trained nurses had also greatly expanded. In the article, Booker T. Washington wrote, quote, "The rapid rise of the Negro physician and the growth and multiplication of these Negro hospitals throughout the South has opened a wide field of service to the colored nurse among the members of her own race in the South, as well as among white people," end quote. Tuskegee graduates worked at hospitals throughout the South, treating both Black and white patients. Washington proudly noted in the same article that 5 students from Tuskegee served as nurses during the Spanish-American War, the only African-American women who served as nurses during the conflict. St. Vincent's Hospital in Birmingham was opened just a few years later in 1898 and welcomed its first class of nursing students in 1900. At the hospital's first graduation ceremony in 1903, just 3 nurses were honored. However, under the management of Sister Christison Monahan, a nun from Emmitsburg, Maryland, the hospital grew quickly. In 12 years, the hospital's capacity grew from 30 patients to 250 patients, and the number of nursing students grew from 3 to 35. Monahan became the state's first registered nurse in 1916 and implemented a rigorous training program to adhere to these new registration standards. During a typical day, nursing students would often work 8 or 9-hour shifts at the hospital and also attend classes and lectures. In 1918, Monahan would travel to Italy with a group of her students and young graduates from St. Vincent's. Alabama nurses who volunteered for overseas service were really at 2 distinct points in their careers. The first group consisted of mid-career nurses who had either gained experience serving in previous conflicts as volunteer nurses, or they had completed their training in states outside of Alabama during the 1890s or early 1900s. These nurses arrived in Europe with extensive training and years of experience working as public health nurses or administrators. With their training and experience, these mid-career nurses were well prepared to meet the challenges that they encountered at military hospitals in France, and many served capably as chief nurses and administrators or in specialized wards under challenging circumstances. A second group of early career nurses completed their training at Alabama hospitals in the decade before the war began. The largest group of these young Alabama nurses who trained and served overseas together traveled with Sister Monahan to serve at Base Hospital 102 in Vicenza, Italy. For nurses such as Anne May Beddoe, one of Sister Monahan's students, the opportunity to serve overseas inspired long careers dedicated to innovation and service. Today, I'll talk briefly about a few mid-career nurses who served in France, that group of younger nurses who traveled to Italy, and the nurses who stayed at home to serve the sick in Alabama. First, I'll take a closer look at the experiences of 4 nurses who served overseas: Annie Early Wheeler, Amelia Greenwald, Julia Lyde, and Idakiri Seals. The experiences of Annie Early Wheeler speak to the dedicated service of women who volunteered for nursing service during the Spanish-American War and the war in the Philippines. The daughter of former Confederate General Joseph Wheeler, Annie was born in Lawrence County on July 31st, 1868. Her childhood could really be described as idyllic for a young woman who loved nature, was a little bit tomboyish, and was constantly on the move. At her family's plantation, Pond Spring, Wheeler became an accomplished horseback rider who loved to explore the nearby creeks and gardens. She quickly gained a reputation for her fearlessness. In 1893, newspapers as far away as Montgomery and Union Springs published a public interest column about Annie Early Wheeler, describing her as a fair equestrienne. The article said, quote, "She is a most intrepid rider, being absolutely without fear, frequently performing daring feats of horsemanship which would make a strong man hold his breath, with as much undaunted courage as ever gallant little Joe led a cavalry charge in the late unpleasantness. Nor are her rides all in vain. She is familiar with every cabin, nook, and corner in the countryside and mountains near her home, and no or needy or in trouble that she does not help them by pleasant, encouraging words and sweet smiles, never forgetting something more substantial. The way is never too long or the road too rugged for her to carry in her arms any sized bundle for the relief of those in need, flitting like a sunbeam as easily as a bird over all the difficulties in her path," end quote. In 1898, when her father, General Wheeler, volunteered for service in the Spanish-American War at the age of 61, Annie refused to be parted from him. So he goes to Cuba, and pretty much immediately after, she follows on another ship to volunteer as a nurse, despite her lack of any formal nursing training and her fear that she lacked an aptitude for nursing. When her ship of volunteers arrived in Cuba, it was met by no less than Clara Barton, who at this point was an elderly and well-respected president of the American Red Cross. When they met her at the dock, Clara Barton encouraged Annie Early Wheeler and other volunteers to leave and return to the United States. Wheeler was undeterred by this less than enthusiastic welcome, and she set to work at the hospital in Santiago, where she faced daunting conditions during a yellow fever epidemic. She wrote, quote, "We went down and found about 60 very sick soldiers lying on the floor in the uniforms they had worn for a month in the sun and mud. There were absolutely no hospital supplies whatever," end quote. Wheeler used her considerable influence to secure new clothing and supplies for the troops and earned the respect of Clara Barton and her patients. Newspapers throughout the United States described her service and gave her the title the Angel of Santiago. After returning from Cuba, Wheeler remained interested in nursing and completed special medical training at St. Luke's Hospital in New York, and then volunteered for service in the Philippines. By the time the United States had entered World War I, Wheeler was probably one of the most well-known and experienced military nurses with ties to Alabama. At 50 years old, she volunteered for overseas service. Her request was initially denied because her brother was already serving overseas. However, when that restriction on service was lifted, Wheeler was stationed at a base hospital in France, where she provided the comforts of home to the wounded troops. She wrote, quote, "I work in the wards from early morning till night at night, with a tray slung from my neck like a street vendor's. My tray is filled with cigarettes, gum, oranges, etc." For others like Amelia Greenwald, nursing was a bit of an unexpected career choice. The daughter of Prussian immigrants, Greenwald was born in Gainesville, Alabama on March 1st, 1881. Her father, Joseph Greenwald, was a prominent member of the local community, working as a merchant and serving as Gainesville's mayor. The youngest of the family's 8 children, Amelia was born into a life of privilege, and her family expected her to marry and start a family, not embark on a lifelong career. However, Amelia had other plans. Against her family's wishes, she moved to New Orleans to attend the Toro Infirmary's training school for nurses, which was known as Tyson for short. Despite her family's disapproval, Greenwald graduated from Tyson in 1908 and embarked on a career that would take her as far away from Alabama and her family as she could get. After working briefly at hospitals in Florida and North Carolina, she moved to Maryland, where she studied psychiatric nursing at Johns Hopkins University. In 1916, she became the director of the New Jersey Public Health Association, where she launched a successful campaign to improve the community's milk supply and hire a new health officer. Her graduate training in psychiatry and her previous experience in hospital administration prepared her well for her wartime experiences. During World War I, Greenwald worked at several hospitals in France. She initially volunteered to work in a psychiatric unit, treating shell-shocked patients. Later, she served as chief nurse at a hospital located on the front lines in Verdun, which was shelled frequently. She also, shortly after the war, helped establish the first American hospital in Koblenz, Germany. Idakiri Seals' pre-war experiences mirror those of Amelia Greenwald's pretty closely. Seal was one of 9 children and was born in Fort Deposit in 1876. She also moved to New Orleans to attend nursing school and graduated from the Nurses Training School at Charity Hospital in 1903. In 1908, she briefly moved to California in order to take classes at the Nurses Training School at California Hospital in Los Angeles. After completing her studies, she returned to Louisiana and worked as a private duty nurse until the war began. During World War I, Seal was stationed at Base Hospital 24. Located in Limoux, the base hospital was housed in an abandoned factory building flanked by military barracks that served as patient wards. The hospital and its nearby sister hospitals, base hospitals number 13 and number 28, were conveniently located near a railroad line. Men who were wounded on the front lines could be loaded onto train cars quickly and transported to the base hospitals, where they were triaged on the train platform and transferred to the appropriate ward for treatment. Between March 1918 and January 1919, Base Hospital 24 treated more than 7,000 men who were wounded at the front or who contracted illnesses in the trenches. Decades later, Idakiri Seals proudly recalled caring for those wounded soldiers at the base hospital. One of the few items she kept to document her wartime service was a pair of scissors that she wore on her uniform, in which she used to, quote, cut away many, many bandages from wounds. The last of our mid-career nurses I'd like to talk about today is Julia Lyde. World War I actually offered Julia Lyde a second opportunity to serve her country during wartime. She was born in Talladega in 1872 and graduated from the Garfield Memorial Hospital in 1895. She had went to Washington, D.C. to take her classes. Shortly after her graduation, she spent a year working as a nurse during the Spanish-American War. After the war ended, Lyde moved frequently, working at hospitals in Colorado, Alabama, and Michigan. At the age of 45, Lyde enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps, and a year later, she was sent to France. Nurses serving at base hospitals in France often found themselves working in military barracks and warehouses that had been repurposed to serve as hospitals, so less than ideal conditions. Lyde was prepared for the conditions at the 3rd Division Hospital located near Chateau Thierry. When she arrived at the temporary hospital in the summer of 1918, she and other nurses discovered that the building was full of rubbish, dirt, and debris, too dirty to house wounded patients. Making the best of a bad situation, the nurses quickly cleaned the building and prepared to care for the influx of wounded soldiers arriving from the battlefront. As the fighting intensified in July of 1918, the hospital was bombarded by enemy fire. Despite the attacks, Lyde and her fellow nurses continued to treat wounded soldiers at the hospital. Conditions at hospital units and just generally where you were staying were considerably better for the members of the Loyola unit, which is a group of doctors and nurses that come from Louisiana and Alabama to serve together. The unit included 19 Alabama nurses who completed their training at hospitals in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Mobile. The largest group from the Loyola unit that's trained together was a unit of 10 nurses who completed their training at St. Vincent's Hospital in Birmingham. The students set sail in the summer of 1918 under the watchful eye of their instructor, Sister Christison Monahan. So you can see Sister Monahan in this photograph. She's in the back right, and she is the only one that is wearing the wimple. So you can see her, and you can see some of her students there, including Anne May Beddoe. She's wearing the pennant holding the pennant and is directly to the left of Sister Monahan in kind of the checked dress in the front. So we'll talk about her a little later. When this group arrived in Vicenza, Italy in the fall of 1918, they established Base Hospital 102, the only American base hospital in Italy. Although the hospital was located just 15 miles from the front, Alabama nurses serving in Italy were housed in much nicer quarters than the nurses that were serving in France. The young nurses gushed about their surroundings. They were housed in a fully furnished villa, which featured a ballroom and a stone terrace. This is what Nurse Sarah Babb had to say about their living conditions. She wrote, quote, "Although we are the nearest nurses to the Italian front, we have many of the comforts of the moderns: electric lights, 3 bathtubs and a shower, and an abundance of cold running water, silver, china, glassware, and table linen for our dining room, which we also use as a recreation room," end quote. Despite that beautiful setting and that enthusiasm, the realities of war were never really far away. Babb also wrote, quote, "Aeroplanes fly low over the crow's nest, and from the stone's terrace, I look across to snow-covered mountains, over which the smoke of battle hangs like a cloud. The roar of big guns is like thunder in a far-off storm," end quote. The war was never really that far away, and as fighting intensified on the Italian front during the Vittorio Veneto campaign, the nurses treated larger and larger numbers of Italian soldiers wounded by those not-so-distant guns. Nurses at Base Hospital 102 primarily treated Italian soldiers wounded on the front. Unlike other base hospitals, they almost exclusively treated men wounded in combat instead of men plagued by routine illnesses. For at least one of the nurses, Anne May Beddoe, who we've already pointed out in this photograph here, combat service would really change the direction of her career. As the 25-year-old Anne May Beddoe helped prepare patients for major surgery at Base Hospital 102, she noticed how patients would panic when anesthesia was administered. So the most commonly used anesthetic during World War I was ether, which was administered by a drop mask that was placed directly over the patient's face. So you can imagine how traumatic this would have been for soldiers who had been gassed on the front. So often patients would struggle and resist anesthesia as they panicked because that gas and that mask was going directly over their face, and they would resist that anesthesia as long as possible, which caused their muscles to tense and made surgery even more difficult and dangerous than it already was. Anne May Beddoe noticed the suffering and particularly took notice of the panic that accompanied administration of anesthesia, and she would look for new ways to ease that suffering after the war. So what happens for nurses who are left in Alabama? For nurses who were left in Alabama while others were selected for overseas service, it was difficult not to feel at least a little bit left out. While Alabama nurses were proud to serve at hospitals in the United States, some were still disappointed that they were not selected for overseas service. Lina Hamilton Denny, the state's first Red Cross nurse, wrote that she, quote, asked constantly to be sent for overseas duty, end quote, but remained stationed at Camp McClellan in Anniston. In 1900, Denny had been one of the first responders to arrive in Galveston, Texas, after a hurricane decimated the town. Approximately 20 years later, Red Cross officials denied her request for an overseas appointment, declaring her too old to serve in Europe. She was 46. However, as the war in Europe ended in the fall of 1918, the nurses, such as Lina Hamilton Denny, who remained behind in Alabama, fought back one of the greatest epidemics of the 20th century. As thousands of nurses had answered the Red Cross's call to serve at base hospitals across Europe, hospitals in the United States faced a shortage of trained nurses. In her article, Alert to the Necessities of the Emergency, U.S. Nursing During the 1918 Influenza Pandemic, historian Arlene W. Keeling estimated that more than 9,000 white nurses had been assigned to overseas duty in Europe when the influenza pandemic struck. Thousands more were stationed at military base hospitals throughout the United States, meaning that civilian hospitals were dangerously understaffed at a time when trained nursing care was essential. Since there was no treatment for the flu, patients required attentive care from nurses around the clock to heal and try to recover. The flu pandemic hit Alabama with a vengeance in October 1918. In Birmingham alone, 12,000 cases of flu were reported, resulting in 500 deaths. Statewide, more than 145,000 cases of flu were reported, and almost 5,500 Alabamians had died by the end of 1918. Overnight, hospitals across the state were filled with sick and dying men, women, and children who required around-the-clock nursing care. Civilian hospitals, already short-staffed thanks to the Red Cross mobilization to hospitals in Europe, were woefully unprepared to stem the tide of disease. Conditions were particularly challenging in two locations: Alabama's military bases and in rural communities where access to medical care was already limited. The flu spread rapidly through Alabama's military bases, where thousands of men were housed in close quarters. Although the base hospitals were well equipped to care for routine illnesses, they were very unprepared to care for the large number of men who fell ill during the epidemic. At Camp Sheridan in Montgomery, the base hospital was staffed by 50 to 100 nurses and could at a normal time house about 1,300 patients. In October 1918, almost 6,000 patients were admitted to the hospital, and a small group of nurses and volunteers struggled to care for the patients efficiently. On October 21st, Lucy Durr described conditions at the hospital. She wrote, quote, "For 5 days, I've seen nothing but rain and sick men. Rain has made bad conditions worse. If this flu keeps up much longer, the casualty list over here will be longer than the one in France." So you can see Camp McClellan, they admitted about 6,000 in October of 1918. They were still dealing with the backlog, so about 7,400 patients were treated in total. Remaining in Alabama was particularly demoralizing for African American nurses who were systematically excluded from overseas service despite that shortage of trained nurses. African American nurses who applied for overseas service expressed their frustration when they began to receive their overseas assignments after the war ended. The Journal of the National Medical Association reported, quote, "The day after the armistice was signed, colored nurses began to receive telegrams thick and fast, advising them to be ready for overseas duty if called." The journal's editor responded that African American nurses, quote, "had been ready since the day the United States entered the war, if being willing, eager, and prepared to serve whenever and wherever needed is implied by being ready," end quote. Despite the discrimination that they faced, African American nurses continued to provide life-saving care to Black and white patients throughout Alabama during the flu pandemic. One young nurse, Bessie B. Hawsey, found herself desperately fighting the pandemic in rural Alabama with little to no support from other medical professionals. Hawsey had graduated from Tuskegee in 1918 and found work in Talladega County, where she treated an African American family devastated by the flu and pneumonia. Hawsey described her experiences a lot more effectively than I can, so I'd like to quote a long passage from a letter that she wrote to the Journal of the National Medical Association in 1919. She wrote, "I shall tell you of an experience of which I am very proud. 8 miles from Talladega, in the backwoods, a colored family of 10 were in bed and dying for the want of attention. No one would come near. I was asked by the health officer if I would go. I was glad of the opportunity. As I entered the little country cabin, I found the mother dead in bed, 3 children buried the week before, the father and remainder of the family running a temperature of 102 to 104 degrees. Some had influenza, others had pneumonia. No relatives or friends would come near. I saw at a glance I had work to do. I rolled up my sleeves and killed chickens and began to cook. I forgot I was not a cook, but I only thought of saving lives. I milked the cow, gave medicine, and did everything I could to help conditions. I worked day and night trying to save them for 7 days. I had no place to sleep. In the meantime, the oldest daughter had a miscarriage, and I delivered her without the aid of any physician. I didn't realize how tired I was till I got home. I sat up at night alone, and one night with a corpse in the house. The doctor lived about 20 miles away. He came every other day. He thought I was very brave. I didn't realize till it was over just how brave I was. Despite the limitations that Bessie Hawsey faced, including limited experience and a lack of professional support, she cared for the family admirably. Alabama nurses served with distinction during World War I, saving lives at home and abroad. After the war, they continued to display the same values that they had defined and experienced in their wartime experiences. After the war, Alabama's World War I nurses made a significant impact on the nursing profession. Bessie Hawsey found work treating both Black and white patients in Georgia and North Carolina. In the spring of 1919, she wrote, quote, "I am very proud of the fact in such a short time that I have been able to practice with Negro, white, Jewish, and German doctors. I have learned something from each," end quote. After submitting dozens of requests to serve overseas, Lina Denny finally got her wish in 1920 when she was assigned to work at a base hospital in Poland. The day before she was set to leave and set sail, she fell and injured her knee. Despite the painful injury, she still traveled to Poland and worked at a hospital in Warsaw from March to July of 1920. The woman who was too old for overseas service in 1918 continued to volunteer for the Red Cross until at least 1945 and died at 1955 at the age of 91. Annie Early Wheeler would also volunteer for overseas service one last time during her lifetime when the United States entered World War II. Her request was also declined due to her age. At the time, she was 73. She remained at home in Pond Springs, committed to raising funds for the war effort, caring for her family home, and providing for the needs of her neighbors and friends. Miss Annie, as she was called by members of the community, was beloved in and around her home and extremely well known throughout her lifetime. She died in 1955 at the age of 86. In the 2 decades following the war, Amelia Greenwald worked in Europe and the Middle East, working at nurses' training schools in Poland and Palestine. In 1923, she established the Jewish Nurses Training School in Warsaw, the first nursing school in Poland that accepted Jewish students. She was awarded the Polish Golden Cross of Merit, the nation's highest award, in recognition of her accomplishment. However, the shadow of war cut her career short and changed her life forever. As violence against Jews erupted in Nazi Germany in 1939, Greenwald helped 2 of her cousins immigrate to the United States after their father was killed during Kristallnacht. The woman who had spent a lifetime trying to escape her family moved to Louisiana, where she raised one of those cousins, Lizelette Levy, who was 15 years old at the time she was adopted by Greenwald. Greenwald would later say that Lizelette was the greatest blessing of her life. Anne May Beddoe would never forget the patients who struggled and suffered as they were prepared for surgery at the base hospital in Italy. After the war, Beddoe completed advanced training at the Lakeside School of Anesthesia in Cleveland and returned to Birmingham, where she became one of the state's first nurse anesthetists. In the 1930s, Beddoe championed the use of a new anesthetic, sodium pentothal. The drug could be administered intravenously, which eliminated the need of that drop mask that caused patients to panic so badly during World War I and helped patients fall asleep more calmly. Sodium pentothal would become one of the most widely used anesthetics of the 20th century and would remain in common use until after World War II. While many Alabama nurses had successful careers after the war, World War I cost some nurses their health and their lives. Julia Lyde survived the attacks on the 3rd Division Hospital in the summer of 1918, but as she prepared to return to the United States, she suffered from a severe case of appendicitis. She died on February 24, 1919, at a base hospital in France. Allies on 2 continents mourned her death. The French government posthumously awarded her the Croix de Guerre in recognition of her service. And in the United States, Lyde was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. In Alabama, the Nurses Recreation Building at Fort McClellan was renamed in her honor. After serving at Base Hospital 24, Idakiri Seals returned to the United States and tried to resume her career as a public health nurse. However, she could never fully escape the horrors of war. In 1921, she suffered a nervous breakdown. She spent the next 3 years in and out of mental hospitals and sanitariums, struggling to move beyond the memory of the war. Plagued by stress and lingering health problems, she never served as a nurse again. And I like to end with these 2 photographs side by side of Idakiri Seals because I think it speaks to the human cost and the human sacrifice of the war. So on the left, you see Idakiri Seals in her nurse's uniform in 1918 as she's preparing for service overseas. And you see her on the right only 10 years later in 1928, and it's remarkable how much she has aged in that time. I think you can see a sadness to her in that later picture, and you can also see that her hair has almost really gone white or completely gray. But I think it's important to notice that as much as nursing took out of her, and wartime nursing particularly, cost Idakiri Seal, she's still incredibly proud of her nursing service. So in the 1928 picture, if you look closely at her collar, she's still wearing her Red Cross service pin on her dress, which I think is pretty remarkable. Geography and a shared profession connected Alabama's World War I nurses, but time and circumstance were not the only factors that united these women. Alabama's first generation of professional nurses shared several qualities that made them effective nurses: a sense of compassion, a commitment to service, and an interest in education. At a time when opportunities for women were often limited, they forged a new path. Their commitment to excellence shaped the future of the nursing profession, not only here in Alabama, but throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haley, for that amazing presentation. And it was so interesting to hear about those women who served and sacrificed during World War I. And it's definitely an important thing to remember today on Veterans Day, to remember the women just as much as we remember the men who sacrificed during that war as well. Now it's time for some Q&A. To our audience, unfortunately, this is a pre-recorded presentation, and so we will not be able to take questions live like we normally do, but if you leave any questions in the comments below, we will be able to see them and come back and answer them once we kind of are able to kind of gather again at the archives. And so feel free to go ahead and put that here. But now I'm going to have a little chance that I can ask some questions to Haley and maybe talk and discuss the impact and the legacy of these women. So Haley, one of the first questions that I have, you were talking about how, nursing is kind of this acceptable profession for women. And something I was thinking through is, I don't know if your research, if you were able to find, what makes nursing kind of this acceptable pathway and profession for women to have?
Oh, that's a great question. So I will say that it's important to note that even though this is considered an acceptable profession, a lot of the women who serve here, their family's still really reluctant to see them serve, especially overseas during a combat situation. Amelia Greene, her brother comes to New Orleans when she's training to become a nurse and tells her to come back home, but she refuses. You also see a little bit of hesitancy, especially during her service in the Philippines from Joseph Wheeler when Annie Early Wheeler volunteers for service. But that being said, I think that nursing becomes accepted as a profession. It's one of the ways that women can serve their country during wartime. So there's already an established notion that women are going to serve as nurses based on Civil War service on both sides, Confederate and Union, during the war. So I think that's part of it. Part of it is also because nursing is a service profession. So a lot of people make the argument at the time that nursing is a natural extension of women's concern and care for others. So, nurses are going to be caring for people outside of the home in the same way that most women are going to be caring for their families. So I think that's part of the reason that this becomes an acceptable profession.
Definitely. So there's this kind of acceptability to it, but also these women are still kind of breaking the mold by taking on this profession. And in many ways, choosing a profession over maybe marriage or family in that kind of more traditional sense of a woman's place. So one other kind of big overarching question is we have right now open Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women in the Vote, which is about suffragists and women kind of working to get more involved in politics. And one part of that story is World War I, because this is in the middle of that suffrage fight. But there's kind of like this pause you see sometimes in the suffrage movement of, okay, now we're going to focus on the war. And then they come afterwards and they bring that fight back. Do you see any connections between, the women who are becoming World War I nurses and the suffrage movement? Can you talk about how those are maybe interconnected in some ways?
Sure, absolutely. So I think it's important to note that I'm still doing research on these particular women who serve as nurses. And so far, I haven't been able to find any kind of direct correlation to their service in the suffrage movement. So I'm not seeing them go and give speeches the same way that Botsy O'Brien Hunley, who is mentioned in Justice Not Favor exhibit, are going out and giving speeches. They're busy serving as nurses during this time. But I think it's important to note that by entering into a profession, they are entering into this bigger conversation about what women's role should be. Should women stay in the home? Should they primarily be caring for husbands and children? Or should they be expanding their view into other areas of service? And one of the things you'll see, especially in the early section of Justice Not Favor, where we talk about related topics that women are discussing as part of making the argument that they should be involved in politics, is they're very interested in making sure that people are aware that women are working. They're interested in labor reform for women and children. Primarily, most of that has a working class rather than a professional influence, but it's still a conversation that's happening. And women also make the argument that as mothers and as wives, as people who are caring for families, they have a direct need to be involved in political conversations related to health and the well-being of children. So thinking about professions like Amelia Greene, who's working for the milk service in New Jersey and is providing fresh milk to children, that directly goes into that conversation about political activism that women are having as they're approaching suffrage.
Definitely. So there is definitely this connection between them wanting to be outside of the home, and part of that is whether or not they're directly involved in that argument. They're kind of still kind of becoming that woman, that new woman that the suffragists are kind of holding up as, look what we can do and look what we're capable of doing.
Yes.
Perfect. So you mentioned Amelia Greenwald, and I found it fascinating how you were able to follow through and see where some of these women went after World War I. But I'm intrigued by her story, especially what happens after 1939. I know she brings her cousin to live with her, but what's the rest of their story? Is she still a nurse after that time, or does she kind of change professions?
As far as I can tell, she continues to work as a nurse while she's taking care of her cousin. And what's fascinating and kind of unique to the time is that she never marries. So she is a woman who is raising this young woman really by herself with pretty limited involvement from the rest of her family. So as I mentioned, they were able to, the Greenwald family was able to bring two relatives out from Europe. So they were able to have visas for Lizelette and her brother. Lizelette's brother is adopted by Amelia Greenwald's brother, who lives, I believe he's still living in Alabama, but Amelia and Lizelette remain in Louisiana and continue to work and serve in Louisiana. Lizelette actually lives until she only passed away just a few years ago, and she becomes a really prominent member of the Jewish community in New Orleans and attributes a lot of her success to the influence of Amelia Greenwald. So it's just an absolutely fascinating story.
Definitely. No, when you were telling about it, my ears kind of perked up, because that was her whole pathway of living in Europe for a while, and then kind of how they were coming back was very interesting. Beyond just her work as a nurse, she has kind of other interesting part of the story. So another question about an individual woman. So why was Lena Denny too old for service? Because you said she was 46, and I was doing some math, and albeit I'm a historian, so maybe my math is wrong, but it seems like some of the other women were at least in their 40s. during World War I. So why was she turned away for service?
So your math is absolutely not wrong. So yeah, so I had to double check myself as well. But we have women that are serving up to, until their 50s, their mid 40s and their early 50s in World War I without any kind of questioning about their age. So two of the ones that we have mentioned recently, Julia Lyde and Annie Early Wheeler, are both older than Lina Denny when they are given permission by the Red Cross and commissioned to serve overseas. And so I think at least part of what happens with Lina Denny is there's a bit of a personality conflict between Lina Denny and those who are making decisions at the Red Cross board. So here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, we have her applications for service. And it's interesting to see the commentary that goes back and forth between Lina Denny and the Red Cross board.
I'm sure she was very upset because she was, I mean, I know how it would be if you're working towards this and you want to go over there. There's definitely like a parallel to seeing some young men who wanted to go over and fight as well. And so you kind of can already see that parallel between her and their stories. And so one final question for you.
Okay.
And it's, on this day, on Veterans Day, as we kind of come to honor all of our veterans, what do you think the legacy of these nurses is? Why should we, study them and listen to their story and kind of give them the spotlight on Veterans Day?
Oh man, I think that's such a great question. And when I started researching and learning about these nurses during the World War I centennial, a lot of the realities that they faced felt a little bit distant and abstract. So talking in 2017 and 2018 about an influenza pandemic felt a lot different than it does thinking about it in 2021. But I think so much. Thinking as an individual, going through what we have in the past 2 years, it's easy to feel overwhelmed with what's happening in our world. It's easy as one person to say, well, I can't change anything that's happening around me. And, there's not anything I can do to help. And so just from a personal perspective, especially as we started the shutdown in March of 2020, I thought a lot about these women. And I thought about the fact that, as stressful as the pandemic was for me, that these women were dealing with a pandemic while they were also seeing the end of a world war. Their brothers and fathers and friends and loved ones were fighting overseas with no guarantee that they would ever return or they would return as the same people. And, they had the choice to stay at home and do the best that they could do to just wait and survive as they waited for their loved ones to come back home. But that's not what they did. They went in every day, even when their service felt small and the challenges they faced felt insurmountable, and they rolled up their sleeves and they did something to make the world a better place. And that's what I hope I personally take from these women, is a greater appreciation that even when we can't control all of our circumstances, we can just roll up our sleeves and help do something to make someone's life a little bit better every single day. I think that's their legacy. And I want to say here, I don't want to talk a lot about COVID because I know we're all tired of talking about it at this point. But I want to say also that this has given me a much greater appreciation for what doctors and nurses have done historically and what they're still doing today. I think it's absolutely incredible what the men and women who are helping us today are doing. So I wanted to end on a note that says, this very much has a real world impact even today.
Definitely. I think that everything you said is 100% correct. And their legacy is that perseverance, that sacrifice, and that continued push to try to make the world a better place. And that's through, for them, medicine. And I definitely think that's an amazing kind of last takeaway point from this presentation. So thank you so much, Haley, for your time today and for telling us a little bit more about Alabama nurses in World War I. And to our audience, remember you can post a comment with a question for Haley and she'll be able to answer it shortly. And please join us again next month. We will have another installment of the Alabama Women's History Series. You can check out our social media to find out when that will be. Thank you all so much for joining us.